Picture the Bay of Naples in the year 34 CE. The water is a living mirror, glittering with sunlit ripples, each swell well as blue as the heavens above. A boy of 12 cuts through the waves with the grace of a dolphin lungs stretched to their limits as he dives for shells on the sandy bottom. He counts silently in his head, pushing himself deeper, longer, 30 heartbeats, then 40, then nearly a full minute before breaking the surface with a gasp of triumph. His younger brother laughs and splashes him, eager to prove he can last just as long. Their father, standing on the family's small fishing boat, shouts encouragement. For them, the sea is more than livelihood. It is a playground, a teacher, a second home. But on the horizon, shadows appear. 3 galleys, sleek and menacing, slice through the water with unnerving precision. Their sails are dyed a rich purple, embroidered with the golden eagle of Rome. No fishing crew sails in such finery. These are imperial vessels, and every village along the coast knows what their arrival means. The children stop their play, squinting against the glare. Their father's face turns pale, his jaw set as if he has just seen a death omen. For weeks, strangers had lingered near the shore, pretending to tally fish catches or trade goods, but their eyes rarely strayed from the children swimming in the surf. They had watched how long this boy could stay, under how easily he cut through the water. They whispered notes to each other, careful not to alarm the villagers. Now the purpose of those silent assessments becomes clear. The soldiers disembark swiftly armored sandals, crunching on the sand scrolls in hand, bearing the emperor's seal. Their words are couched in legality. The emperor requires promising youths for service, an honor for the community, an opportunity for advancement. But their eyes betray cold calculation. They look at the boy not as a son, not as a person, but as a specimen. They ask him to dive to retrieve a coin tossed into the shallows. He obeys proud to show his skill, unaware of the trap. He surfaces with the coin still clutched in his hand after nearly 3 minutes underwater. The soldiers smile. That is all the proof they need. The father pleads. His son is too young. The family depends on him. Surely others would be more suitable. A soldier silences him with the flat of a spear. Resistance is treason. Compliance earns a handful of silver coins that cannot replace a child. The boy, confused and frightened, is pulled aboard the galley. His brother clings to his arm until the soldiers pry them apart. The last thing he sees of home is his mother collapsing on the shore. Her screams drowned by the crash of oars striking water. The journey to Capri is only 2 days, but for the children packed into the ship's dark hold, it feels eternal. Dozens of boys sit huddled together, eyes wide, some whimpering, others too stunned for tears. The smell of sweat and fear hangs heavy in the air. Older boys whisper warnings of marble pools and strange games, of those who please the emperor and those who vanish without a trace. Rumors swirl, half-truths carried from village to village. The younger ones don't understand, but the terror is contagious. When at last the island comes into view, it should be beautiful. Capri rises from the sea like an emerald fortress, its cliffs jagged and majestic, its slopes dotted with villas that gleam in the sun. But the details unravel the illusion of paradise. Watchtowers dot the coast, soldiers patrol the docks, and no ships, other than imperial craft, are visible. The island is a cage disguised as a jewel. As the galley glides into the harbour, the boy clutches his knees to his chest, shivering despite the warmth. He remembers the shells he collected just yesterday, treasures he meant to show his brother. Already, that simple life feels impossibly distant. The soldiers herd the children ashore, barking orders in clipped Latin. Physicians in white robes wait, with tools and scrolls, examining each boy like livestock. They check teeth, measure height, test lung capacity by timing how long each child can hold his breath in the shallows. Those who meet the criteria are given fresh tunics and escorted up the winding paths toward the emperor's villa. Those who fail vanish down side passages. The boys never see them again. That night, lying on a narrow cot in a marble chamber, the boy listens to muffled sounds echoing through the villa, splashing water laughter, then silence. He does not yet know that he has been chosen as one of the little fish's children whose swimming will be twisted into acts no innocent mind could imagine. He does not yet understand that Capri, with its sunlit cliffs and fragrant gardens, is not a retreat, but a machine. A place where childhoods are ground into dust to feed the appetites of the most powerful man in the world. The boy who dove for shells in Naples has already begun to disappear. In his place, something new is being fashioned, a prisoner, whose body will be trained, tested, and consumed. By tomorrow, he will learn the first rules of survival. By next year, he may no longer recognize himself. Capri has claimed him as it has claimed so many before. When Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus became emperor in 14 CE, Rome believed it was entering a new golden age. He was no reckless youth like his predecessor Gaius, no flamboyant conqueror like Julius, no populist like Augustus. He was seasoned by decades of command, intelligent, pragmatic, and deeply experienced. Born into the Julio-Claudian family, raised under Livia Drusilla's iron will, he carried the aura of a man forged in discipline. He had led armies across the Rhine and Danube, pacified mutinous legions, and expanded Rome's frontiers. To many senators, his rise promised stability. Yet, behind this promising facade was a man already fraying under the weight of contradictions. Tiberius was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the practiced gravity of a soldier. But he was also notoriously reserved, prone to dark moods, and deeply uncomfortable with Rome's endless rituals of flattery. Suetonius describes him as both capable of immense self-control and beneath the surface boiling with resentments. He never fully embraced the role of emperor. It had been thrust upon him, and though he accepted he did so, like a reluctant actor forced into the lead role of a play he did not enjoy. For his first decade, he played that role well enough. Rome prospered under his careful stewardship. He reformed provincial administration, maintained a balanced treasury, and avoided unnecessary wars. His policies were measured, his governance pragmatic. But even during these years of apparent success, hints of fracture appeared. He was suspicious of the Senate, disdainful of their sycophancy. He loathed the city's constant intrigues. And when personal grief struck first with the death of his beloved son Drusus, then the poisoning of his grandson Tiberius began to pull away from public life. By 26 CE, his withdrawal was complete. He abandoned Rome altogether, retreating first to Campania and then to the island of Capri, 12 miles off the Italian coast. Officially, the move was justified as a respite for his health and an opportunity to escape the stifling politics of the capital. Unofficially, it marked the beginning of a transformation so dark that later historians would struggle to put it into words. Capri was no accidental refuge. The island rose like a natural fortress out of the Tyrrhenian Sea, its cliffs sheer and nearly unscalable, its currents treacherous. Only 2 harbours allowed entry, both closely guarded once the emperor took residence. A handful of villas dotted the island before his arrival, but Tiberius reshaped Capri into a sprawling imperial retreat. He built 12 villas each, commanding a different vantage point, but none more infamous than the Villa Jovis, perched atop the island's highest plateau. From here, he could see all approaches, the glittering expanse of the Bay of Naples stretching to the horizon. No one could reach him unobserved. At first, the retreat was framed as modest. Letters were dispatched to the Senate, assuring them that the emperor remained attentive to affairs of state. Messages arrived by courier official business, carried out through intermediaries. But slowly, Rome realized it was being ruled from afar. Capri became both throne and prison, a seat of power and an escape from accountability. The island itself began to change under imperial presence. Marble terraces extended from cliffs gardens filled with exotic plants imported from the East Fountains, and pools carved directly into the limestone. Engineers constructed aqueducts to bring fresh water and chambers to regulate bathing pools. To visiting eyes, it was paradise, a jewel box of luxury suspended above the sea. Yet, even at this early stage, whispers began. The pools were too deep, the passages too secretive, the architecture too perfectly suited not to pleasure but to privacy. Tiberius himself was shifting. The emperor who once embodied Roman austerity began to indulge in secrecy, paranoia, and strange rituals. He surrounded himself with astrologers, magicians, and a private guard loyal only to him. Senators who fell out of favor were summoned to Capri under polite pretexts only to vanish or return disgraced. Executions multiplied in Rome, as the Praetorian prefect Sejanus acted in the emperor's name, purging rivals while his master brooded by the sea. By the early 30s CE, the retreat had curdled into something darker still. Suetonius Tacitus and Cassius Dio all record rumors of systematic debauchery, particularly involving children and adolescents. Stories spoke of boys trained as little fishes, swimming beneath the emperor in his pools. Tales of cruelty circulated infants used in obscene games, youths forced into acts that turned innocence into horror. Some of these accounts may have been exaggerated by senatorial writers eager to discredit a disliked ruler, but archaeology lends troubling support. The pools and chambers of Villa Jovis exist to this day, designed in ways that align too perfectly with the activities described. What began as withdrawal had become a machine of secrecy. Capri, with its steep cliffs and guarded harbours, was the perfect stage for appetites that could not be indulged under the watchful eyes of Rome. And here lay the contradiction. An emperor celebrated for disciplined military order and administrative care had transformed into a recluse, orchestrating one of history's most systematic programs of abuse. The Roman people could not see it directly. From the Forum, Capri was a distant shimmer on the horizon, glimpsed only by sailors or fishermen. Yet rumors trickled back. Parents along the coast whispered of boys taken by imperial agents. Senators returning from visits to Capri spoke with careful vagueness, their eyes betraying unease. The island, once a place of retreat, became synonymous with fear. And so the empire endured under an absent ruler, its daily affairs managed by bureaucrats and generals, while its supreme leader descended further into private darkness. Capri's cliffs became a wall, not only between the emperor and his people, but between reality and rumor, governance and indulgence. humanity, and monstrosity. The boy taken from Naples was now a prisoner in this secret empire. His life, like so many others, had been consumed by one man's retreat from the city he was sworn to rule. Capri rises from the Tyrrhenian Sea like a jewel set against the horizon. To sailors approaching from the Bay of Naples, the island's limestone cliffs shimmer white in the sun, their sheer faces plunging directly into waters so deep they seem bottomless. Pines cling to the ridges, and hidden grottos sparkle with blue light where sea meets stone. To the Romans of Tiberius's age, Capri was a place of retreat, a landscape of serenity and natural beauty. But for those who lived and suffered beneath its marble roofs, paradise quickly turned to prison. The geography itself was perfect for secrecy. Capri lay only 12 miles from the mainland, close enough for messages and supplies to flow steadily, yet isolated by treacherous currents and abrupt cliffs that made escape almost unthinkable. No boy brought here could swim back to freedom. The waters that once promised play and livelihood became an impenetrable barrier. Watchtowers lined the heights, and imperial guards monitored every vessel. The island became a closed world, where what happened within its borders could be hidden from Rome's eyes. At the crown of this island, Tiberius built his fortress palace, Villa Jovis, the Villa of Jupiter. Rising nearly 1,000 feet above the sea, the villa was a marvel of engineering and cruelty combined. Its foundations sprawled across the summit of Monte Tiberio, with terraces stepping down the cliffs and cisterns collecting rain to sustain its luxury. White marble colonnades framed courtyards open to the sky, while inside frescoes depicted gods and sea nymphs frolicking in mythic oceans. To a casual visitor, it was a monument to imperial grandeur. Yet the very design that celebrated Rome's mastery over nature also cloaked darker purposes. Villa Jovis was not alone. Tiberius scattered his retreat across multiple villas, Damacuta Palazzo, Amare, and others. Each had its own pool's chambers and hidden corridors. But it was Villa Jovis that served as the emperor's main residence, a citadel where beauty and terror walked hand in hand. Archaeologists today can still trace its outlines, the baths with their intricate heating systems, the long corridors where footsteps echoed endlessly, the balconies perched over dizzying drops to the sea. Legend holds that Tiberius used those very cliffs for executions, ordering prisoners hurled into the waves where soldiers with hooks ensured no body survived the fall. Within the villas, the pools were more than places of leisure. They were designed with deliberate variation shallow basins where children could stand deeper cisterns for long submersions, even interconnected channels that allowed silent movement underwater. The architecture seemed tailored not just for bathing, but for control, for staging the rituals that sources like Suetonius would later describe with horror. The sound of water against marble was constant, a backdrop masking cries that could not escape the stone walls. Secrecy was paramount. The island's isolation meant that staff and guards were carefully chosen, bound by loyalty or fear. Those who served the emperor here were complicit in maintaining silence. To speak of Capri's hidden life was treason. To betray it was death. Even merchants who ferried goods across the bay saw only the outer walls of magnificence, never the inner routines. Capri became a stage with two audiences. Rome, which imagined its emperor resting in quiet seclusion, and the island's captives who endured the truth. For the boys taken here, the geography was a constant reminder of entrapment. From the windows of their dormitories, they could glimpse the endless sea shimmering with the same sunlight they had once known in freedom. But now the horizon mocked them. No sails ever approached, except those bearing the purple insignia of Rome. No fisherman dared come near without imperial sanction. The cliffs themselves were guards, the sea a moat. Capri was not a paradise. It was the perfect prison carved by nature and perfected by human ambition. And for Tiberius, it was the perfect canvas. Here, cut off from the Senate, from the crowds, from even the city's gossip, he could shape his private world to match the contours of his desires. Capri's beauty gave guile to its horror. The same waves that lapped gently against grottos carried away the screams of those who vanished. The same marble floors that gleamed under torchlight bore the weight of both feasts and atrocities. In the empire's imagination, Capri was a retreat. In reality, it was a laboratory where power isolation and indulgence fused into monstrosity. The boy who once collected seashells in Naples had now entered this world. He would find that every pool, every corridor, every cliff face was part of a machine designed not for escape, but for erasure of freedom of identity of childhood itself. The emperor's pleasure was not left to chance. It required an endless stream of new bodies carefully selected and delivered with the precision of a supply chain. Capri's marble pools demanded boys trained by nature in the sea itself, and so the hunt began along Italy's coasts and beyond. Imperial agents' men who appeared at first to be tax collectors, recruiters, or envoys, watched the waters with the eyes of predators. They would linger at fishing villages from Campania to Sicily, pretending to inspect docks or collect levies, while in truth, their gaze followed the children who darted between boats, diving for oysters, chasing schools of fish, or competing in breath-holding contests for the amusement of their fathers. They took notes discreetly: age, appearance, stamina. A boy who could hold his breath for 2 minutes underwater was marked. A child whose shoulders hinted at strength, but whose face bore delicate symmetry, was ideal. These agents knew what pleased their master, and they recorded everything. The selection was specific. Unlike the mass slave markets of the Forum Boarium, where captives from war were sold in droves, this was targeted acquisition. Tiberius wanted not labourers, but what he called his little fishes. They had to be young between 8 and 14. Supple enough to be trained, old enough to endure, yet still far from manhood. They had to be beautiful, according to Roman standards of proportioned skin and hair. And above all, they had to swim. The families who lost these children were given no real choice. Sometimes soldiers arrived with scrolls stamped with the imperial seal, declaring that the emperor required attendance for service in Capri. To refuse was treason. Other times, small sums of money were pressed into calloused hands, 30, 50, perhaps 100 denarii. Enough to silence a starving household, but never enough to replace a son. Mothers wept silently, fathers bowed their heads. To resist was to risk execution. To comply was to betray the very heart of their family. Those with means tried to hide their children. There are whispered tales of families sending boys inland, disguising them as girls, even scarring their faces to make them undesirable. But secrecy was fragile. An agent could return with soldiers, and what was hidden would be found. In some villages, whole cohorts of boys disappeared in a single day. The sea suddenly emptier of laughter, the nets pulled in with grief rather than fish. Not every child was taken to Capri. The selection was ruthless. Some were rejected for crooked teeth, a limp, a cough. These were discarded as unsuitable, though even rejection could mean conscription into other forms of service or sale into the general slave markets. But those chosen for the emperor's pools were marked by destiny far darker. They were torn from kin and herded toward the purple-sailed galleys waiting offshore. The collection had the air of an official ritual. Soldiers lined the shore, their armor gleaming, their faces impassive. The children were paraded before a physician or a senior officer who conducted final inspections. Hands stretched out, mouths forced open, limbs bent to test flexibility. Boys were commanded to dive and retrieve coins thrown into the shallows. Their gasps for breath became a cruel audition. Those who failed were shoved aside. Those who succeeded were loaded aboard. The purple sails unfurled, and another wave of little fishes was bound for Capri. Parents stood on the shore, powerless. Some clutched tokens of their sons' discarded sandals, a half-finished toy carved from driftwood. Others shouted blessings, desperate that their children might remember home. But as the ships pulled away, the cries diminished, drowned by the crash of waves and the creak of oars. The horizon closed like a curtain. For the empire at large, this process was invisible. Official records describe these boys as attendance pages or companions to the emperor. Inscriptions, when they exist, sanitize the horror, reducing living children to lines of ink on papyrus. Yet the whispers spread, carried by sailors who had seen too much, by mothers who wailed too loudly to be ignored. The name of Capri began to shift from a retreat of beauty to an island of fear. The paradox deepened. Rome prided itself on its laws, its order, its piety. Yet, at the empire's very heart, law became the tool of abduction. Honor was twisted into silence, for who would accuse the emperor himself? And so the hunt for children continued, unchecked, systematic, relentless. Each boy taken was another note in the emperor's private symphony of cruelty, another thread in the tapestry of horror woven across Capri's marble halls. For the boy who once swam for seashells, the abduction was not an accident of fate, but the outcome of this machinery. His talent in the water, once a source of joy, had become the very reason for his captivity. Innocence had been redefined as weakness, beauty as a sentence. The sea, once his playground, had betrayed him into imperial hands. The voyage to Capri was short, but it felt endless. The purple-sailed galleys cut across the Bay of Naples like floating prisons, their decks echoing with the muffled sobs of boys pressed into corners of the hold. The air was thick with brine, sweat, and fear. For many, it was the first time away from home. For all, it was the last time they would see their families. The holds were crowded with bodies. Some children clutched each other, trying to recreate the comfort of home. Others sat alone, staring at the planks, as if by sheer will they might melt into the wood. Older boys whispered fragments of rumor about pools carved in marble, about games with the emperor, about those who vanished without a sound. Fear spread faster than the sea spray. By the second night, the rhythm of the oars became unbearable. Each stroke was a drumbeat of inevitability. The rocking of the ship, which might have been soothing under other circumstances, felt like the lull of a predator. A few of the younger boys cried for their mothers in the dark, only to be hushed by soldiers' sharp commands. The sea offered no mercy. When the island finally came into view, it appeared first as a dark line against the horizon, then as cliffs rising sheer from the water. To innocent eyes, Capri was beautiful. Jagged white limestone shining in the sun, crowned by green hills, the sea shifting from sapphire to emerald in its shadows. But to those aboard, the sight curdled into dread. This was no paradise. It was a trap set by nature itself, high cliffs, treacherous currents, and watchtowers that guarded every approach. Disembarkation was swift and merciless. Soldiers herded the boys onto the docks, where more officials waited, with wax tablets and styluses in hand. Each child was called, forward examined, and catalogued like livestock. Teeth were pried open limbs bent, and stretched skin inspected for blemishes. The younger ones were told to run laps on the dock to show stamina. The swimmers were ordered into the shallows, diving for coins tossed deliberately far into the bay. Every movement was watched, every breath measured. The imperial physicians oversaw the process. These men robed in white looked more like priests of a strange ritual than healers. They carried scrolls with notes from scouting agents comparing records to flesh. Some boys were declared fit and marked with chalk across the shoulder. Others were deemed defective, too weak, too scarred, too sickly. Those not chosen were led away to unknown fates. Some may have been sold elsewhere, others simply vanished. Their cries, cut short, lingered like ghosts in the salt air. Those marked fit were escorted inland along narrow stone paths that wound up the cliffs. The ascent was grueling, and the boys exhausted from the voyage, and the examinations stumbled often. Guards barked at them to keep moving spears glinting in the sun as reminders of what resistance meant. At the summit, the sprawling silhouette of Villa Jovis came into view, gleaming white against the blue sky. Its walls seemed to merge with the rock, a fortress palace, overlooking all approaches. Inside, the grandeur was suffocating. Marble courtyards opened into vast chambers, their walls covered in frescoes of sea gods, nymphs, and dolphins. What might have been enchanting, in another context felt cruelly ironic here. Neptune painted with outstretched arms seemed less a protector than a reminder of the ocean that had delivered them into captivity. The boys were led through colonnades into dormitories. The quarters were strangely comfortable. Too comfortable. Rows of narrow beds lined the walls, each with clean linens, bronze oil lamps and storage chests. The scent of fresh plaster and resin hung in the air. But comfort here was a cage. Outside the windows stretched the cliffs and the endless sea, both as impassable as iron bars. The illusion of gentleness only sharpened the underlying terror. That night, as the boys lay in their beds, the sounds of Capri revealed themselves. The muffled splash of water from unseen pools, the faint echoes of footsteps in marble corridors, whispers carried through the stone, some in Latin, some in Greek, some in dialects of places far from Italy, and sometimes a sharper sound stifled cries quickly silenced. Sleep was impossible. Initiation came swiftly. At dawn, guards entered and ordered the boys into a courtyard where bronze basins of water had been placed. They were told to immerse their heads and hold their breath. The physicians watched with cold precision, marking results on tablets. Those who struggled were jeered at. Those who excelled were taken aside. The message was clear. Survival depended on performance. Later, the boys were led into the pool chambers. These were unlike anything they had ever seen. Vast basins carved into the rock itself, fed by channels of seawater, some shallow and warm, others deep and cold. Marble steps descended into the waters, and frescoes of sea creatures adorned the walls. Yet, beneath the artistry was menace. The pools were stages, and the emperor was the audience. Older boys, already initiated, instructed the newcomers in hushed tones. They spoke of rules: never meet the emperor's eyes, never falter in swimming, never refuse an order. They explained rewards: better food, warmer clothing for those who pleased, and punishments for those who failed. They whispered of disappearances of boys who were taken one night and never seen again. The younger children clung to these veterans, desperate for guidance. But the veterans themselves bore the hollow look of those who had seen too much. Their eyes betrayed resignation. For them, survival was not about escape, it was about endurance. The boy from Naples who once dove for seashells now found himself staring at the marble ripples of a pool that would never again mean freedom. His initiation was complete, not when he swam, but when he realized that the water he loved had become his prison. The first days on Capri blurred into one another, marked by drills, inspections, and the suffocating weight of fear. The boys quickly discovered that the villa was not simply a residence, it was a machine designed to strip innocence and reshape children into something else. Something Tiberius desired. At the heart of this transformation was training cloaked in the language of education, but twisted into survival instruction. They called them little fishes. It was not an official title, but one that spread among the boys with bitter irony. Fish were meant to swim silent and quick at home in water. That was what they were being molded into: creatures of the pools, trained to obey, to move gracefully, to breathe less, and endure more. But unlike real fish, their freedom ended at the emperor's gaze. Each morning began with water drills. The boys were lined along the edges of a pool. The surface gleaming under the Mediterranean sun filtered through columns. Guards with staffs and whips stood watch, ready to enforce discipline. At the physician's signal, the boys dove. Some swam eagerly, desperate to prove themselves. Others hesitated and were punished. Breath-holding competitions became routine. Coins were dropped to the pool's bottom, and children were forced to retrieve them, each dive longer, each retrieval deeper. At first, many panicked. Breath burned in their lungs, the pressure of the water seemed unbearable, and the cold stung their skin. Those who surfaced too soon were met with ridicule or lashes. Those who succeeded received small rewards: an extra piece of bread, a warmer blanket. Slowly, the boys learned that obedience and endurance meant survival. Resistance meant pain or disappearance. It wasn't only swimming. Older boys, already conditioned, became instructors of a sort. They whispered rules to the new arrivals: don't splash, don't tremble, don't look directly at the emperor. They demonstrated movements under the water, teaching the younger ones how to glide without bubbles, how to hold still, even when lungs screamed for air. These older children, hardened by years on the island, served as both mentors and warnings. Their hollow eyes, their weary voices told the truth. Survival came at the cost of the soul. Beyond the drills, there was something darker. The emperor's appetites dictated additional lessons, whispered in corners of the dormitories when the lamps burned low. Some of the older boys described tasks that newcomers could not yet comprehend, practices that turned swimming and diving into acts of humiliation. These conversations were not meant to terrify, but to prepare. "Do as you're told, Marcus," one of the veterans urged a trembling child. "It's better to learn quickly than to be punished for failing." The manipulation was as systematic as the training. Rewards created loyalty. A boy who excelled in the pools might be given sweet wine, new sandals, or the rare privilege of avoiding the cold baths. Praise from Tiberius himself, rare but powerful, was treated like treasure. Conversely, failure brought punishments carefully chosen to break will without destroying the body. Reduced rations, long hours of isolation in soundless chambers, or the humiliation of being forced to watch others succeed where one had failed. The line between pain and pleasure blurred until boys lived in constant calculation of what behavior might keep them safe for another day. Psychologically, it was a form of inversion. Roman boys of their age might have begun training in rhetoric swordplay or farming skills, learning to become citizens or soldiers. On Capri, the same rigor applied, but twisted into something monstrous. Instead of learning to fight wars, they were trained to surrender completely. Instead of building pride, they were taught to erase it. The emperor had transformed discipline, the virtue Romans admired most, into a tool of degradation. Meals reinforced this hierarchy. The boys ate together in silence, seated on long benches beneath frescoes of sea nymphs and dolphins. Those who had pleased Tiberius were served first and given larger portions. Those who failed received scraps, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger became another weapon, another reminder that their bodies were not their own. Yet within this suffocating system, bonds formed. The boys clung to one another, finding comfort in whispered words, a hand held in the dark, or stories of home told in hushed tones after lamps were extinguished. They shared memories of fishing with fathers, of running through vineyards of mothers singing them to sleep. These fragile recollections became a kind of defiance, a way to preserve fragments of identity that the island sought to erase. Still, the training ground was littered with casualties. Some boys collapsed from exhaustion during drills. Others broke under the weight of punishment, retreating into silence, refusing to speak or eat until their bodies withered. The staff took note of these failures, and such boys soon vanished, removed from the dormitories in the dead of night. No one dared ask where they went. The boy from Naples, once proud of his ability to outlast his brother underwater, now found that same gift chained to dread. Each dive, each long breath, was not freedom, but obligation. His skill, once celebrated by family, had become the very reason for his captivity. Yet, he, like the others, adapted, because adaptation was the only alternative to destruction. By the end of the first month, the transformation was visible. Shoulders grew stronger, lungs expanded, movements became fluid and silent. But so too did the light fade from eyes. What emerged from the pools were not children playing at the sea, but little fishes, creatures trained to serve, stripped of choice, moving in patterns dictated by an emperor whose desires defined their every breath. The boys had heard whispers of him long before they saw him. The emperor was both omnipresent and invisible. His authority felt in every command, every punishment, every indulgence. And yet, when Tiberius finally appeared by the pools of Capri, the image of the man did not match the grandeur of his title. He was old, worn, his face heavy with lines, his body sagging with age. But in his presence, no one doubted that he held the power of life and death over every soul on the island. The emperor's rituals were deliberate. almost ceremonial. He would recline on a marble platform that extended into the water, draped in fine fabrics to cushion his aging limbs. Around him, the boys swam in silence, circling like schools of fish. Their movements were choreographed, drilled into them until they became second nature. Tiberius called them his little fishes. The name might have sounded affectionate in another context, but here it was chilling. A diminutive nickname that masked ownership, reducing human children to playthings of the sea. Roman historian Suetonius later wrote of this grotesque theatre, describing how Tiberius trained boys to crawl between his thighs while he bathed, teasing him in ways that defied description. He even mentioned infants brought to Capri for purposes too obscene to repeat in polite company. Tacitus, ever the stern moralist, spared no sympathy, depicting the emperor's retreat as a place where depravity ruled unchecked. Even if their accounts carried exaggeration or moral judgment, the consistency of their testimony reveals a system too elaborate to be mere rumor. The daily routine unfolded with grim precision. After morning drills, the chosen boys were summoned to the pools when Tiberius was ready. Guards escorted them in silence, the sound of sandals echoing through frescoed corridors that smelled faintly of sea salt and incense. Inside, the emperor awaited, attended by a small circle of freedmen and physicians, who adjusted the temperature of the water, prepared ointments, and ensured every detail of his comfort. Tiberius himself was not loud or cruel in the way of other tyrants. His manner was soft, almost grandfatherly, which made the horrors he orchestrated all the more unsettling. He would speak to the boys in gentle tones, asking their names sometimes, complimenting their swimming, occasionally offering food with his own hand. Yet, beneath that kindness lay menace. A wrong movement, a faltering breath. A glance held too long, any misstep could mean punishment, banishment, or worse. This was not chaos. It was a system as calculated as any military drill or legal proceeding in Rome. Boys were catalogued, their progress noted by scribes who kept records as if maintaining accounts of livestock. Breath-holding times, physical growth, even temperament were all written down. Each child became a data point in the emperor's ledger of appetites. The emperor's spintry teams of youths trained in deviant intercourse, as Suetonius phrased it, performed for him like dancers, their roles carefully rehearsed. They were not merely random victims. They were parts of a design rotated, trained, and displayed according to imperial moods. Some were favorites shielded from harsher punishments so long as they pleased him. Others became examples disciplined before their peers to enforce compliance. To outsiders, this might appear madness, but to those trapped within it, revealed an unholy fusion of Roman order and personal pathology. Tiberius had once been celebrated as a soldier and statesman, a man of discipline and efficiency. On Capri, those same qualities twisted into something monstrous. The discipline remained, but now it served the maintenance of vice. The efficiency persisted, but it was applied to the systematic breaking of children. The emperor's boredom, paranoia, and lust had merged into an institution as structured as the Senate itself. What made it most horrifying was how normal it seemed to those who lived inside it. Freedmen who had served in Rome now served here, carrying out orders with professional detachment. Physicians adjusted the water, recording health notes, as though maintaining gladiators. Guards enforced silence with whips and spears, but rarely with visible outrage. They too had been absorbed into the system. On Capri, depravity had become routine part of the imperial machine, unchallenged, because power itself demanded it. For the boys' adaptation was survival. Some learned to anticipate the emperor's requests, presenting themselves with practiced smiles, feigning enthusiasm to avoid punishment. Others retreated inward, becoming empty shells who moved mechanically through rituals their minds elsewhere. The cruelty lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the choices the children were forced to make: perform or perish, feign eagerness or face pain, erase oneself or risk erasure altogether. The emperor's twisted system even had its own economy: privileges, better food, extra blankets, moments of rest could be earned through compliance, traded among the boys like currency. In a grim parody of Roman society, hierarchy emerged: the favored ones at the top, the new arrivals at the bottom, the broken, drifting in the shadows. Just as senators competed for imperial favor in the capital, the children of Capri competed for scraps of approval in marble pools. And all the while the emperor watched, his weary eyes alert despite his age. Tiberius knew what he had built. He knew the system worked. The same discipline that had once governed armies now governed boys in water, reducing them to instruments of his desire. Capri had become his empire in miniature, a place where his will was absolute, where the law was what he desired, and where innocence drowned in silence. It was not frenzy, it was structure. It was not madness, it was method. And for those little fishes circling the emperor's body in the still blue pools, there was no end, no escape, only the rhythm of breath and the weight of imperial eyes. Capri was no ordinary retreat. To later travelers, its cliffs and coves seemed like nature's masterpiece, an island rising from the sea like a fortress crowned in green. But for those who lived and suffered there, the island's natural features became part of the prison itself. The geography was destiny. Sheer rock walls plunged straight into the sea, waves crashing endlessly against stone. Treacherous currents swirled at the island's base, ensuring that even the strongest swimmers, those very skills that had led boys here, were useless for escape. It was as if the gods themselves had sealed the island against flight. And atop this natural fortress, Tiberius built his palaces. The most infamous of them was Villa Jovis, the Villa of Jupiter, sprawling across the island's eastern heights. Its ruins still stand today, broken arches and scattered mosaics that hint at former grandeur. From this vantage point, Tiberius could see the mainland, the faint line of Naples Bay, but remain untouchable behind cliffs and guards. Villa Jovis was not just a residence. It was a throne above the sea, and for those within its walls, a cage. The architecture carried double meaning. Publicly, it proclaimed imperial power. The complex boasted reception halls, courtyards, cisterns, and temples to Jupiter and Venus. Archaeological surveys show advanced water systems, cisterns carved deep into rock to store rainfall baths heated by hypocaust systems, gardens carefully irrigated in defiance of nature. To Romanize, this was evidence of mastery over our environment, a palace fit for a god-king. But beneath the surface, the design served darker purposes. The pools were not ordinary baths. Some were shallow, built for lounging, but others sank deep, linked by tunnels that allowed swimmers to pass unseen. Marble stairways led into basins that glowed with torchlight, frescoed with sea gods, Neptune, commanding tritons, dolphins carrying nereids. The imagery was ironic paintings of divine play, surrounded acts of human degradation. Where art depicted harmony, reality delivered torment. Whispers of soundproofed chambers appear in sources. Ancient writers spoke of underground rooms where screams could not reach the open air. Suetonius describes secluded grottos and secret passageways, and modern archaeologists confirm that Villa Jovis included hidden staircases and tunnels connecting upper chambers to subterranean spaces. Whether these were designed specifically for secrecy or adapted later, their effect was the same. What happened in Capri could vanish without echo. The island's other villas like Villa Damacuta and Villa Jovis's secondary complexes reinforced the network. Each had its pools, terraces, and private chambers. They formed a circuit of pleasure and control, ensuring that no corner of the island was free from imperial oversight. Guards posted at docks and cliffs ensured no unauthorized ship approached, no body escaped. Even the sea itself became a wall. For the children, these structures became landscapes of dread. The dormitories might have looked peaceful, narrow beds under frescoes of ocean gods, but they were holding pens. The pools shimmering under Mediterranean sun were arenas. Boys practiced their swimming drills there, their every motion watched and noted. Passageways became routes of fear corridors leading to chambers where they might be summoned or discarded. It is tempting to think of Tiberius as a monster who abandoned order for chaos. But the truth was more chilling. His palaces show deliberate planning systems of surveillance architectural designs that facilitated control. This was not a madman's lair. It was a machine. The architecture itself conspired with the emperor's will, turning beauty into a mask for cruelty. Imagine standing at the cliff edge, looking out at the horizon. The sea is dazzling blue. The sun warms your skin, the villas gleam like jewels. To an outsider, it seems paradise. But for the boys trapped here, that same view mocked them. The mainland was visible, yet unreachable. The very currents that once defined their freedom now held them captive. Capri had become the emperor's personal amphitheater, a stage where power played itself out in silence and stone. Modern visitors who climb to Villa Jovis see only ruins, arches open to the sky. Fragments of mosaic floors, broken walls where lizards sun themselves. Tour guides speak of imperial banquets of marble halls echoing with music. Few mention the other history, that within these halls, power and perversion intertwined. Few admit that the same frescoes admired for their artistry once framed horrors no marble could contain. The paradox lingers. Capri's beauty was its cruelty. The architecture's grandeur was its disguise. What Tiberius built remains one of Rome's most haunting monuments, not because of what can be excavated, but because of what can never be erased. To the world beyond Capri, Tiberius remained a shadowy, distant ruler, issuing decrees through letters and envoys. But inside the villas, within the marble pools and frescoed chambers, the emperor presided over something far more intimate and far more destructive. The boys who had been stolen from their families arrived with wide eyes, still clutching fragments of innocence. Within months, that innocence was stripped away, leaving behind only shells of what they once were. The transformation followed patterns so precise that it seemed orchestrated. Newcomers still raw from capture clung to hope. They whispered of escape, of someday returning home. Some prayed to their village gods, others to Jupiter or Neptune, begging for deliverance. But hope was the first casualty on Capri. The island's geography alone suffocated it. The sight of the mainland so close and yet so impossibly distant, mocked their every thought of freedom. Older boys became reluctant mentors. They knew the rules by heart: when to speak, when to fall silent, how to anticipate imperial moods. They taught survival strategies in hushed tones. Never refuse, never show fear, never draw attention to yourself unless it was the right kind of attention. These veterans did not pass on kindness so much as a manual of submission, a code designed to help others endure what they themselves had barely survived. But survival came at a cost. Each boy who adapted sacrificed part of himself. Compliance brought food warmth and rare words of praise from the emperor. Resistance brought punishments that eroded both body and spirit. Some were denied food left to shiver in cold chambers. Others were isolated underground, where dripping water and darkness drove them toward madness. The message was clear: conform or vanish. Among the boys, whispered categories emerged. There were the newcomers' eyes wide with terror, the veterans who had mastered the emperor's demands, and then there were the broken ones. These were boys whose minds had buckled under the strain. They shuffled through routines like sleepwalkers, hollow-eyed and silent. Their bodies still moved, but their spirits had fled, retreating into unreachable places. Marcus, one such veteran, became a figure of grim respect. He had survived for years longer than most, through a mixture of intelligence and compliance. He taught younger boys how to hold their breath for 5 minutes, how to swim silently, how to anticipate. When the emperor would demand more than just aquatic demonstrations. Yet, behind his instructions lay an emptiness, a deadness in the eyes. Marcus had mastered survival, but lost himself in the process. Then there was Lucius, remembered for his silence. He had been on Capri 4 years when newcomers arrived. His body was thin, his face drawn, and he spoke rarely, if at all. At night, while others whispered of their homes, Lucius lay motionless, staring at the frescoes above his bed, as if searching for escape through painted seashells and dolphins. One day, he simply stopped eating, refused every scrap of bread, every cup of water. Within weeks, he was gone. Some boys whispered that this was his victory, that Lucius had found the only way to leave Capri on his own terms. Suicide was not uncommon. The cliffs that ringed the island beckoned, though few reached them under the eyes of guards. Others found subtler ways: starvation, deliberate disobedience, or silent refusal to move until their bodies gave out. In a world where survival meant complicity, death became the final act of resistance. And yet even those who lived carried wounds deeper than flesh. Nights were filled with muffled sobs, with the sounds of children dreaming of lives they could never return to. Days stretched in endless repetition of drills and rituals, each one eroding their sense of self. The pools that once shimmered like jewels became prisons of water, places where innocence drowned daily. The body too bore marks. Some boys grew ill from exhaustion or infection, their health broken by constant demands. Others carried scars from punishments, welts from whips, or burns from punishments too cruel to name. Even those who appeared unscarred outwardly bore the invisible fractures of trauma. They had been taught to smile when praised, to feign gratitude. For crumbs of affection, to believe that humiliation was survival. Tiberius himself cultivated this system deliberately. He understood how to break a mind as surely as a potter shapes clay. Praise was rationed punishments carefully chosen. He made boys compete for approval, setting them against each other, ensuring loyalty to him alone. By the time they realized what had been taken, it was already too late. The tragedy of Capri was not only the physical abuse, but the systematic destruction of identity. The boys arrived with names, families, stories. They left, if they left at all, as shadows, as little fishes, whose only role was to orbit the emperor's will. Some survived in body, but none survived whole. And in the quiet moments when the marble halls lay still and the sea winds swept over the cliffs, one question lingered in their hollow hearts. Was it better to survive broken or to perish free? What we know about Capri is not born from rumor alone. The horrors that unfolded in the marble chambers of Tiberius's retreat were recorded by Rome's historians, though even they struggled to put words to what had been witnessed or whispered about in the empire's corridors of power. The past speaks through documents, and in those documents lies a chilling confirmation. This was no tale of gossip, but a system so vast and deliberate that it could not be hidden forever. The most infamous descriptions come from Suetonius, a Roman official writing almost a century later in the Lives of the Caesars. His portrait of Tiberius is not merely unflattering, it is damning. He wrote that on Capri, the emperor devised pleasures of the most monstrous kind, surrounding himself with teams of boys and girls whom he trained in obscene practices. Suetonius describes the Spintriae groups of youths forced to perform before him in elaborate couplings, their bodies arranged like grotesque theatre. Even more haunting is the reference to the little fishes, boys trained to swim between the emperor's thighs, while he bathed, teasing him with touches praised or punished according to his shifting whims. Tacitus, the grim chronicler of Rome's politics, is more restrained but no less damning. In his annals, he described Tiberius's retreat as a descent into hidden crimes, his withdrawal from Rome marking the beginning of secrets that shame cannot name. Tacitus, always careful to weigh rumor against fact, leaves deliberate gaps, as if some details were too obscene even for his pen. Yet, his silences speak loudly. Where he pauses, horror fills the space. Cassius Dio, another historian writing in Greek, added to the chorus. His narrative of Tiberius's later years drips with disgust. Capri, he wrote, was a place of banquets of lust, of hidden chambers, of children broken into servitude. Dio's words echo the sense that what happened on the island was not a series of excesses, but a sustained program planned, financed, and protected by the machinery of empire. Skeptics might ask, can we trust these accounts? After all, Rome's historians often wrote with bias, eager to magnify the vices of emperors to explain the decline of moral order. Yet even if Suetonius and Dio exaggerated their testimonies line up too neatly with what archaeology and administrative patterns reveal. Capri's villas were real, their pools still visible. Imperial networks for recruiting children from coastal villages are attested in surviving inscriptions. The consistency of sources across decades suggests more than fabrication. It suggests memory of a scandal too vast to erase. Beyond the major historians, fragments survive in less expected places. Legal documents record sudden disappearances of young boys from coastal families, their names scratched off inheritance rolls with the note taken for imperial service. Inscriptions carved by grieving parents discovered in Campania speak obliquely of children lost to the sea, a phrase some scholars interpret as metaphor for those stolen into Capri's system. These documents do not name the emperor, but their timing aligns with his retreat. filling in gaps the chroniclers left behind. Then there are the whispers preserved in satire. Writers like Juvenal hinted at Tiberius's excesses with bitter irony, mocking the wisdom of emperors who found philosophy in the bodies of children. Though satire exaggerates its barbs only wound when anchored in recognizable truths, Juvenal's venom would not have struck his readers if Capri's reputation had not already spread in hushed tones across Rome's taverns and marketplaces. Perhaps most unsettling is the administrative precision implied by these documents. Suetonius mentions records kept of boys' ages' skills and aptitudes. Though none of these catalogues survive their existence is plausible. Rome was a bureaucracy addicted to lists of taxes, of soldiers, of grain shipments. Why would Tiberius's private institution of abuse be any different? The idea that children's lives were reduced to entries in an imperial ledger is almost too cold to imagine. Yet, it fits the logic of Rome's machinery. Modern historians wrestle with these sources. Were the horrors of Capri embellished to vilify an emperor already unpopular? Possibly. But even if the truth was half as terrible as described, it remains one of the darkest chapters in Rome's imperial story. The careful euphemisms, the silences, the fragments in satire all point toward a collective unease, a shared recognition that something unspeakable had occurred under the Mediterranean sun. The documents do more than record, they expose a paradox. Rome prided itself on law, order, and civilization. Yet, its own writers preserved the memory of an emperor whose private island became a factory of exploitation. These accounts, biased or not, became Rome's guilty conscience carved into words. And so, Capri's nightmare did not vanish with the emperor's death. It survived in ink, etched by historians who could not ignore whispers too loud to silence. Through their documents, we glimpse the machinery of depravity. Boys catalogued, trained, consumed, discarded. Paper and parchment became the only graves for lives that never returned home. The horror was real enough to leave marks in history's record. And in those marks, the voices of the broken still murmur, carried across time by reluctant chroniclers who dared to write what Rome wanted forgotten. By 37 CE, the emperor who had once been hailed as the savior of Rome was a shadow of himself. Tiberius, son of Livia, stepson of Augustus, veteran general, who had pacified the provinces and filled Rome's coffers, was now an old man, worn down by age, paranoia, and the weight of his own excesses. His health failed him, slowly. Skin lesions, swollen joints, digestive ailments, but his grip on power remained. Capri, the stage of his long descent into darkness, had become both throne and prison. It is said he rarely ventured beyond his villas. Surrounded by guards, physicians, astrologers, and the carefully trained fishes of his twisted pools, Tiberius had withdrawn from the Senate, from the Forum, from the people he once ruled with cautious prudence. Rome continued to function without him, the machinery of empire grinding forward under the hands of administrators, prefects, and generals. But the people of Rome, long accustomed to seeing their emperor in public life, began to whisper. Capri was not a retreat, they said it was a cage. And within that cage, their emperor had transformed into something unrecognizable. The end came suddenly, but not without rumor. Ancient sources disagree on the details. But the most famous story has the emperor smothered in his bed by Macro, the Praetorian prefect, or perhaps by Caligula himself, his grandnephew and designated heir. According to Suetonius, Tiberius seemed to rally from a period of illness, rising from his bed to the alarm of those who thought him already dying. Believing he might live, attendants panicked. For a moment, the old emperor's survival threatened the succession, and in that moment, loyalty cracked. A cloak thrown over his face. A heavy pillow pressed down. Rome's second emperor gasped his last, not in a blaze of triumph, but in a suffocating silence. Whether murdered or not, his death was greeted in Rome with unrestrained joy. The Senate, which had long endured his distant rule and harsh treason trials, erupted in relief. Crowds cheered in the streets. Sacrifices were offered to the gods, in thanks that the old tyrant was gone. Suetonius records that people shouted Tiberius to the Tiber, a chant wishing his corpse thrown into the river rather than granted the honours of burial. For many Romans, the emperor's legacy was not of victories in Germany or reforms of the treasury, but of fierce silence and the whispered infamy of Capri. Yet what of those who had lived within the marble prisons of the island? The boys conscripted as little fishes, the servants who had facilitated or endured the horrors, the physicians who examined children like livestock. With Tiberius's death, their lives became unbearable contradictions. Some were quietly released, dispersed across the empire where their trauma would remain unspoken. Others too compromised or too dangerous, vanished. Silence swallowed them, as if Capri had devoured not just their innocence, but their very existence. The villas themselves were sealed. Macro and Caligula, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, ordered the island's chambers closed, its pools drained, its records hidden or destroyed. For a brief moment, Capri seemed to disappear from the empire's memory. Official ceremonies mourned Tiberius as a former general and aware of Augustus, not as the monster who had corrupted paradise. The contradiction was deliberate. Rome preferred selective forgetting, a kind of state-sponsored amnesia, but memory lingered in whispers. Senators who had visited Capri freedmen, who had served their merchants, who had supplied the villas, all carried fragments of the truth back to the mainland. The scandal could not be erased, only reshaped. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, writing decades later, caught the echoes and turned them into narrative. The little fishes, the spintriae, the monstrous indulgences of Capri. These became shorthand for the corruption of power, a parable about what happens when unchecked authority meets human frailty. It is easy to imagine the final days for those trapped on the island. The emperor dying staff, uncertain guards, whispering about the future. Perhaps the boys felt a flicker of hope that freedom might come with his last breath. Perhaps some even dreamed of returning home. Yet most likely, they were silenced, too dangerous as living witnesses to be allowed to speak. Their innocence had been taken, and with Tiberius's death, whatever remained of their identities was extinguished. Capri's pools were empty, but their ghosts lingered in the marble. The paradox of Tiberius's death is that Rome publicly mourned the emperor, while privately rejoiced, and privately mourned the children, while publicly ignored them. It was easier for Rome to condemn one man as aberration than to confront the system that allowed him to reign unchecked, isolated, and monstrous for more than a decade. The empire chose to blame Capri's horrors on the pathology of one emperor, rather than on the machinery of power that enabled him. Thus, the death of an emperor became the death of innocence twice over. Tiberius's victims were erased, their stories submerged like bodies in the deep currents around Capri. Rome celebrated its own survival, but at the cost of forgetting. Only in the fragments of historians do we catch glimpses of those boys swimming in marble pools, their childhood transformed into terror. They had no funerals, no epitaphs. Their memorial was the whispered hatred of their abuser, recorded in the lines of Suetonius and Tacitus. Tiberius's corpse was finally laid to rest in the mausoleum of Augustus, honored with rituals befitting a Caesar. But Capri remained his truer tomb. The island, once a jewel of the Mediterranean, was scarred by memory of the horrors it concealed. And though the empire moved on, Caligula ascending then, others after him, the shadow of those marble chambers lingered. For in the end, the empire could bury its emperor. It could not bury the truth that power unchecked had devoured children in the name of pleasure. The ruins of Capri still shimmer under the Mediterranean sun. White marble blocks cling to the cliff's terraces open to the endless blue horizon cisterns, and pools lie cracked and dry. Tourists walk the same paths once guarded by praetorians, gazing at the scenery that poets once compared to paradise. Few realize that these stones hold a darker memory, a memory Rome itself tried to erase. Capri's legacy is not simply that of imperial retreat or architectural splendor. It is a lesson in what happens when absolute power is removed from accountability. Tiberius did not invent cruelty. Rome itself had long normalized brutality through slavery, public executions, and gladiatorial spectacles. But on Capri, brutality became intimate, systematic, and hidden. The empire that prided itself on law and order created a space where law ceased to exist, where one man's desires outweighed the dignity and lives of countless children. Archaeologists who excavated the villas in the 18th and 19th centuries found frescoes of sea deities, dolphins, nereids, and tritons. To visitors, these seemed like innocent decorative motifs reflecting the island's maritime setting. Yet read against Suetonius's account of the little fishes these images take on a bitter irony. Murals celebrating playful sea life once looked down on children forced to play roles in the emperor's perversions. The iconography that adorned the walls has become an accidental witness, its cheerful paint forever haunted by context. Roman historians themselves struggled to describe Capri. Tacitus, master of insinuation, couched his narrative in moral judgment, hinting at excess without descending into detail. Suetonius, less restrained, described acts so shocking that even later copyists sometimes omitted passages. What unites their testimony is not exaggeration, but the sense that Capri represented a line crossed. Rome could tolerate extravagance, cruelty, even madness in its rulers. But what happened in those marble pools felt like a transgression of civilization itself, a corruption not only of bodies, but of the very idea of empire. The legacy of Capri was also political. Tiberius's withdrawal created a vacuum in Rome, filled by ambitious men like Sejanus, whose intrigues destabilized the Senate and sowed fear through treason trials. His absence allowed corruption to spread, and his secret horrors tainted the legitimacy of imperial rule. Caligula, his successor, carried the stain of Capri into his reign. Suetonius suggests that Caligula raised partly under Tiberius's eye, inherited not just the throne, but also the psychological scars of that environment. Capri was not only a prison for boys, it was a crucible for Rome's future tyrants. And yet Capri also reveals something about Rome's society at large. Why did no senator, no official intervene? Why did the system of law and governance, so proud of its traditions, allow one man to transform an island into a factory of abuse? The answer is power. Rome's greatness, the legions, the aqueducts, the forums rested on obedience. When the emperor withdrew, obedience remained. To challenge him would have been to challenge the structure of empire itself. Capri endured not because of Tiberius alone, but because silence was safer than truth. Modern visitors may look at the ruins and see only beauty. They marvel at the engineering, the views, the sense of timeless elegance. Yet, beneath their feet, children once learned to swim in silence, to hold their breath until lungs burned, to transform their fear into a performance for imperial amusement. The island's cliffs, which now charm photographers, once ensured no escape. The same sea that carried poets and merchants also carried boys torn from their families, their innocence left to drown in marble pools. The legacy of Capri forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can the achievements of Rome, its law, its art, its empire, be admired without acknowledging the suffering that underpinned them? For every aqueduct, there were slaves in chains. For every triumphal arch, there were captives paraded and executed. And for every villa, like those on Capri, there were silenced victims, whose stories were almost lost to history. Perhaps the truest monument to Capri is not the crumbling walls, but the silence of its victims. They left no inscriptions, no memoirs, no epitaphs. Their names were erased deliberately. Yet, through the accounts of Rome's own historians, their suffering flickers back into view. Tacitus's cautious prose, Suetonius's lurid detail both preserve fragments of voices that empire sought to bury. The ruins speak too, not in words, but in the eerie resonance of empty chambers built for pleasure turned into prisons of innocence. Capri's lesson extends beyond antiquity. It warns that unchecked power removed from scrutiny will almost inevitably twist toward exploitation. Whether in marble palaces, royal courts, or modern institutions, the pattern recurs. The more isolated authority becomes, the more human beings are reduced to instruments of gratification or control. Capri is less an anomaly than a mirror showing what happens when societies look away. In the end, the legacy of Capri is not only horror, it is also testimony. For though Rome tried to erase history remembered, the ruins still stand, the accounts still circulate, and modern audiences can still ask the questions that Romans suppressed. Who were those boys? What became of the survivors? How do we reckon with a civilization that could build such beauty and harbor such cruelty in the same breath? Capri remains both paradise and prison. Its cliffs shine in the sun, its waters sparkle, but its stones remember, and so should we.